Hello, I'm Aaron Crane with Team Dynamics, and welcome to this TDX Academy video on building a ticket workflow. Ticket workflows can be used to support many different business processes, such as an approval to purchase equipment or to support a change management process. They can even be used to integrate with other systems. By the end of this video, you'll be able to create new ticketing workflows, understand the types of workflow steps that are available, learn about role approvers, and interact with a ticket within a workflow. As an aside, you'll find additional information on ticket workflows within our Team Dynamics knowledge base. This is available at solutions.teamdynamics.com, and you can find articles on workflows within the TD Help section under Ticketing Applications, Working with Ticketing Applications. To successfully build a workflow, you'll need an understanding of your business process, Team Dynamics Administrator access, and access to a ticketing application within TD Next. Alright, let's get started building a ticketing workflow. To begin creating a ticketing workflow, we need to start in the Team Dynamics Administration area. Workflows are specific to a ticketing application, so we also need to drill down into a specific ticketing app so that we can create our workflow. So I'm going to come into the Applications area of TD Admin, and then select one of my ticketing applications. You'll notice then down all the way at the bottom on the left-hand navigator is a workflow section. In this example, I'm going to build a workflow that supports a process of buying a computer. So the scenario might be somebody in the field wants to request a new computer purchase. They submit a request to the service desk, and that goes through an approval process and a series of tasks to ultimately purchase and then deploy the computer. I'm going to start. The first thing that I need to do is actually create a workflow, create the shell, if you will, of a workflow that I can then put my steps in. Again, down at the Workflows area, I'm going to come and click the New button under Ticket Workflows. So I'll call this Computer Purchase Workflow. I just simply need to give it a name, and I can give it a description or purpose if I'd like for further information. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and save. And now I actually have a new workflow added to my Team Dynamics Administrator environment. Furthermore, I'm going to click on the name of the workflow that I just created. And here's where we'll start creating the different steps and really putting the structure of the workflow together. A workflow primarily is made up of a series of different workflow steps, and there are several types, and I'm going to cover each one of those as we go through this process. So really to begin, what I need to do is go into what we call the Workflow Builder, which I can access by clicking the View Builder button, and that's going to open up a separate window. And it's basically at this point a blank canvas where I can begin to create my workflow. Now every workflow has two default steps, or I guess rather than call them steps, I'd rather call them endpoints, which are an approval and a reject. So these are places where the workflow is eventually going to end. It's either going to move all the way through the process that I create and represent as a workflow, and then get to an approved area, approved point, or in one of my processes I'm going to have a rejection, perhaps a particular step, and if I flow down through that, then the entire workflow is going to terminate, and we call that a reject step. I like to think of this workflow builder as kind of like your canvas to create a workflow, so I always move my approval, my finalization, approval, and reject steps to the right-hand side because I'm essentially going to paint, if you will, a layout here of a workflow using the different workflow types. So a couple of things before we get started. You'll see a few menus up here at the top. I'll start with the File menu. And within the File menu, you've got a few different options. There's a Save, which will just save the draft of your workflow that you're building. There's a Validate process, which I'll do this a couple times as we start to build, which will actually validate the workflow that you've built and make sure there aren't any errors in it. For example, not terminating or not connecting a couple of steps together. There's a handy feature called Arrange that will kind of just start to align everything so it's a little bit easier to look at, because you'll see as we start building this, you'll kind of be laying it out all over the place, and Arrange just kind of tidies it up, if you will. Finally, there's a Save and Check In. So when you're finished building your workflow, you can check it back in. So this does work in a check in and check out fashion, and you can see over here to the right, the user that I'm signed in as currently has this workflow checked out. And that gives an indication to another administrator perhaps that may be coming in and wanting to make a change to the workflow. he or she could not do that until my workflow was checked back in. And then lastly, of course, there's an undo checkout process. In addition to the file menu, there's a workflow menu, which gives you both two options, a details area and a stages area. So the details area is where you could come and edit the name or description, as well as some promotion classifications and approval and rejection statuses. I'm going to go ahead and save that and come back to that a little bit later after I build my workflow, because I think it'll make a little bit more sense towards the end of the workflow build out. You also have the concept of stages, and stages are sort of at a macro level above the individual steps. So I may have steps A, B, and C, and that's part of stage 1. And then I have steps D, E, and F, and that's part of stage 2. So it's just a way to collect them on a macro level. And then if you view the workflow from within TD Next or TD Client, you can actually get a visualization of what stage the overall process is in. Again, I'll illustrate this as we start to build out the workflow. And so really that brings us to the last option in the menu, which is the New Step button. And this initially, as we start to build our workflow, is what we'll use most often. So workflow is comprised up of different types of steps, and I'll cover each one of those steps. So we're going to use several of the different steps to create my computer purchase workflow, and hopefully it'll all come together. Okay, I'm going to click the New Step button, and that's going to pop open the New Workflow Step window. And when you build a workflow step or add a workflow step, you really need to at least provide two initial pieces of information, that being the name of the step. And the name of the step is important because that's what will appear to the, in most cases, the TD Next technician that's going to be assigned and working the step, or perhaps the client user that needs to approve it. And so the name is actually fairly relevant, so it's good to give a rather user-friendly name or something that makes sense as it relates to the workflow. So I'm going to build this computer purchase workflow, and hopefully it makes sense as it comes together. But the first thing that I'm going to do in my step is to actually put an approval step in place. And when I say approval step, it gets back to there are several different types of steps, and they all do some different function. So I'm going to give a brief explanation right now. An approval step is an assignment that allows the assigned person or role, as you'll see here in a minute, or even assigned people. It gives them the opportunity to approve or reject the step. And that can branch the workflow into two different directions. So if they approve it, it goes down path A. If they reject it, it follows path B. You've got branch and collector steps. Those primarily are used to ease administration in a lot of cases, might be the best way to describe it. So a branch step can be inserted, and then multiple steps can kind of fan out from that branch. And again, this really is just to ease administration and make building the workflow a little less error prone, especially if you're coming back after the fact and adding some steps. And don't worry, by the way, I'll go through these again as I start to build my workflow, but I initially wanted to introduce them. A collector step is somewhat maybe the opposite or at the tail end of a branch, so you often use them in conjunction with each other. A collector step brings multiple other steps together, so it collects steps, so things can kind of channel into it. Maybe the one sort of important or uniqueness to a collector step is that you can essentially pause the workflow until all the steps that precede it are collected. So most often this is used when you've got maybe simultaneous tracks going on, and you want to make sure all these different individual tasks or steps are completed before the workflow continues on. A task step is something that you'll commonly use. This is just to assign a task to a person or group in the workflow. So we're going to use several examples of those as I build out my workflow step. We have a timer step, which is just a wait period. So I can insert a time step, and then the workflow will just sit there and wait for that amount of time. And when it expires, it'll move on to the next step in the process. And then lastly, and probably one of the more powerful steps, is there is a web service call. So I get to a step in my workflow, and I can make a web service call to another system, or maybe to one of the Team Dynamics APIs, just depending on what it is. So it's very powerful, and I can use this really for an integration point. I'm not going to go into detail in web service steps in this video. There's a separate TDX Academy video on using web services steps, but I at least wanted to introduce it. So the first thing I'm going to do in my computer purchase workflow is to add an approval step. So I'm going to name this Manager Approval of Computer Purchase Request. Okay. So essentially this is going to be the first step in my process. So the scenario I'm trying to create is that you might have an employee submit a computer purchase request, and the first thing that happens is that a approval step just goes to that individual's manager for approval. So before continuing on, before anybody's put to work actually fulfilling the request, we're looking for the manager to first approve it. So I've named my step. I've selected the type of approval. Again, I can add a little bit more of a verbose description if I'd like. And then what I have in this section below is how this is going to get approved, or maybe better stated, who is going to actually approve this. So I really have a couple of options here. I can select specific people or groups here under the approver section, or a little bit more dynamically, I can select approver roles. So what I'm going to select is the requester's manager in this case. So what the requester's manager means is that whoever submits the request, it's their manager value or their reports to value that's actually going to be assigned to the approval step. And we have several examples of these approver roles. So I can set the approver to the requester of the ticket, the requester's resource pool manager or primary group manager, the creator of the ticket, the creator's manager, the responsible person of or group of the ticket, the reviewer of the ticket, the service owner, so this is the name associated with the service that's applied to the ticket, and then the department manager. That's the account department value. So all of these can be used as variable approvers, as we refer to them, and that's going to insert the correct approver based on some details of the ticket. Again, who created it, who requested it, the requester's manager, and so on and so forth. So in my example here, I want the requester's manager because the person making the request for the new computer, I want his or her manager to actually approve the request. Now, whenever you use an approver role, it's important to probably specify a fallback. And what a fallback is let's say that the requester's manager, so the reports to value, doesn't have a value, or there's nobody assigned to the ticket, or there's no account department manager. There could be some scenarios that, based on configuration, they're actually left blank. So this fallback is basically a user inserted so that if all else fails, there is somebody that's still responsible for approving the step and can continue the process or at least intervene. Okay. And then a couple other things to talk about here. There's an approval mode. So if I have multiple approvers or roles assigned to this step, it talks about whether or not I need all of them to approve it or if any of them can approve it. So let's say I have John Doe, Jane Doe, and Brian Smith all listed as approvers for a workflow. If I said all as the approval mode, all three of those individuals would have to approve before the workflow could continue. If I had any as an approval mode, then any one of those three people could go in and approve the request, and then the workflow would continue on. And last but not least, there's an option for item approval and rejection. If this box is checked, if either one of those boxes are checked, if the approval or rejection happens, for this particular step happens, it will approve the entire workflow. So you'd probably only use this in a couple of unique cases where you wanted a step to actually finalize at that point in time and can complete the workflow. One tip to point out as you're adding an approval step, you'll see here that several of these fields, there are little question mark tips, and I really encourage you to actually take a look and read these, because there are some nuances or again tips that's very helpful when building your workflow. So there are some nuances there that are worth reading, just as you may be contemplating the various combinations of things that you could use when you're building a workflow step. I'm going to go ahead and save this And now I've got a step created, and I can go ahead and close this window, and you'll see back here in my builder that I have my first step. So I'm going to treat this as the first step in my workflow process, and then I'm going to actually build on from here. So in my scenario, again, I wanted a manager to approve the request, and let's assume for a minute that the manager did actually approve the request. So the thing that I believe that would occur after that is that that computer purchase request would come to the help desk or the service desk, and somebody would be responsible for perhaps creating a quote or evaluating the request and maybe building an order together, if you will, to provide back to the requester. So I'm going to do a new step, and in this case it'll just be what we call a task. Let's call this review request and provide quote/feedback. And this is going to be a task, and I'm going to, again, I can provide a description, and I have to set the responsibility of the task. And so in my scenario here, I'm going to call, let's say that this is the application development group. It's responsible for doing this. I don't know if that's a valid scenario or not, but we're just that's a group that I have available, so I'm going to go ahead and select that group. Now, a couple other items that or options that you see here. There's a wait for tasks to be completed. And you probably would check this because what this means is that the workflow will wait, overall the workflow will wait before continuing on to further steps in the process. So what it's saying is this task must be completed before the next one will become active. So I want that to occur. Also, there are options to set the estimated hours and the complete within time. Now what that is going to do is set the overall estimated effort or hours for the task, as well as set the due date. So I might say complete within 4 hours. And what will happen there is, let's say the task becomes active at 12 p.m. at noon on a Monday. That would mean that the due date would be set to 4 p.m. that same day. And again, as you see, just like in my approval step, there are some important tips that are worth reading underneath the question mark tips area. So I'm going to go ahead and save that just like I did the other step. And now I have a second step in my workflow. And here's now my first opportunity to actually start to connect some things. So assuming approval, I'm going to hover over the approve area and I'm going to hold my mouse and then drag that over to my task. So what that means is, assuming this is approved, this approval step is approved, it will then move the workflow to the task. If it's rejected, probably what makes logical sense is that I complete the whole workflow under a rejection step. So I'm going to move that over there. And don't worry, you can always change your mind. You can rearrange things, but for right now I'm going to make that assumption. Now periodically what I'm going to do is just come in here and save my workflow just to preserve my changes. I briefly mentioned earlier the validation process. So I could validate and see what happens here, and it turns out I do have an error. And the error is that I don't have really any way that I'm getting to the end of the workflow. So it's missing a line connector maybe here. But of course I'm going to put some other steps, so I don't want to do that yet. I just wanted to illustrate what the actual validation process looked like. Now to continue with my workflow, I'm going to actually add another approval step. So I'm going to click my new step button, and I'm going to say review computer quote. And again, this is going to be an approval step, and I'm going to make the approver, in this case, actually the requester. And again, I need to have a fallback, so we'll do that. Now, since I just have one approver here in this situation, my approval mode is somewhat irrelevant. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave that as all. And I don't want to approve or end the entire workflow at this point, so I'm going to also leave these boxes unchecked. I'm going to go ahead and save that, close my window, and then drag that over here. And I'm going to start to, maybe get myself a little bit more screen real estate, move some of these things around. The reason I wanted to put that other approval step in my scenario here what I've got is, again, just to review, the request will come in. It's going to immediately go to the manager of the person that's making the request. Assuming approval, that request is going to go to the service desk to actually put together a quote in this scenario, and then once the service desk gives feedback, provides that quote, there's going to be a review process that goes back to the person that actually made the request for them to review that quote and then to approve or reject, to make the workflow continue on. So let's assume that a couple of things happen here. Let's assume for a minute, just to keep tying things together, that the requester rejects the quote that's been provided. What we're going to do is just send that right back to the step before, and now we can, kind of create a scenario where we're looping through things until we've got a valid quote. Assuming, though, that then they do approve it, what I want to do is put another task in place for somebody at the service desk or maybe a procurement individual to actually place the order. So I'm going to actually represent that as a task. So I'll click New Step, and I'll say Place Computer Order with Vendor. And we're going to make that a task step, and we'll just assign a particular person to that. Again, we want to wait for the task to be completed before continuing on. I could set estimated hours if I want, and I can also set a complete within. If I leave those blanks, it'll just accept the defaults, 0 estimated hours, and then complete within almost immediately. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and drag that task over. You can start to see, as you get several steps, you may have to arrange things just to make it a little bit more visually appealing. You can start moving things all the way to the right, and it'll give you a scroll bar at the bottom, which will probably be the case in a lot of instances, just because you'll have several steps and you want to lay it out so it's easier to consume and read. So I'm going to place this task here, and then from the approval of the review computer quote, I'm going to move that over to the Place Computer Order with Vendor task. Okay, so now here's a good opportunity to illustrate another of the task types, the step types, I'm going to use a timer step. And I'm going to use a timer step just to kind of play with my scenario here. Let's say we place the order with the vendor, and we're just going to wait a period of 7 days, perhaps, before continuing on, assuming that the order needs to be received and then processed and fulfilled by the vendor. So I'm going to do a new step. Wait for hardware vendor to fulfill order. And in this case, I'm going to make it a timer step, and then I'm just going to I can supply some duration, and the workflow will just wait for that amount of time. And I can elect to use operational hours, and which would mean that's effectively my business days as defined in Team Dynamics under the operational hours area, or I can use just basically a running counter. So let's use operational hours in this case, and let's say it's going to be like 10 business days. That's if I put a 10 here and check use operational hours, I'm essentially saying we're going to wait 10 business days. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, and hopefully you can start to see the pattern here. I got to grab my timer step, and I'm going to move that right over here after the computer order. And again, I'm going to drag that, and like before, I'll come up here and actually save that draft. Okay, just a couple more steps in my process, and then I'll have my first sort of draft of my workflow. Continuing on with my scenario, I'm waiting for the hardware vendor to fulfill the order, and I'm going to do a couple more steps. So assuming that the time has expired, the next thing I'm going to do is make an active task back to the service desk to actually deploy the laptop. And then after the deployment, I'm going to put another approval step back to the requester so that they can essentially sign off, and then my workflow will be complete. So hopefully this is starting to become routine. I'll say deploy new hardware to requester. That's going to be a task. We're going to send that to the help desk user. Again, I'm going to wait for it to be completed. Complete within 24 hours. I'm going to save that. Always put your new task at the beginning, so sometimes you might have to drag back to the front if you've got a very large workflow. Let's move things around a little bit here. Drag that up. Again, connect it, and then one more. Approve computer hardware delivery and setup. Again, this is for the requester to basically give final sign-off that they receive their computer, their equipment, and essentially they're saying that they're complete. So I'm going to make that an approval step, and again, the requester is the approver. I'll make a fallback. Just the help desk user. Again, that shouldn't really be needed because there always should be a requester, but I think it's good practice to do so. Go ahead and save again. And grab that approval step. Move things around a little bit here. And let's assume for a minute we should connect everything. So let's assume that for some reason they don't approve it. We'll probably just send that back so that the help desk or the service desk can take care of that until it's eventually right. And then finally we'll end the workflow by connecting that final approval task step to the complete. So I should have a completed workflow here. I can go ahead and click save. I can validate things. It will validate on save as well. And I'll show you what this arrange does. It kind of just aligns things up sort of in a nice, neat fashion, just because they can get a little bit out of sorts as you're dragging things around. But now I've got a nice organized workflow. Okay. So what I'm going to do at this point in time is actually save and check in, and that checks in my workflow. Again, I could come back and edit this at a later date, but I've now got a checked-in workflow, which would actually be valid for use here once I do a couple additional steps. Okay, now that I've got a workflow, or at least a collection of task steps, workflow steps organized into a workflow, I need to do a couple additional things here to sort of round out my workflow so that I can put it to use inside of my ticketing application. I'm going to go back and check out my workflow because I need to make a couple more changes to it. And I came here earlier in this video and talked about some of the details and options and then stages. So let's revisit both of those. As I go under details, again, I said earlier that you could come and rename your workflow and change your description, but there's also some important other options that are available to you. There's something that we call promotion classification. And promotion classification would allow you to change the ticket classification at some point in the workflow. So I could switch this from a service request to a change, for example, or an incident to a change. Now, I don't know that particularly applies in my given scenario, but I'm going to go ahead and just select one of these options just so that you can see what else you have to complete when you do so. So if I indicate that I want to change the ticket classification from whatever it is to a change, I then can identify when I want that change to occur. Does it happen after the workflow is approved, so basically at the end? Does it happen after a step is approved or completed, or when a particular step starts? And if I select either one of these two options, I'll then have the option to identify which step it should occur at. So if I left it like this, what I'm essentially saying is when the deployed new hardware to requester step is completed, then promote my ticket from whatever classification it is at the time to a change. So, based upon your particular business process, you may find some applicability to that. for my workflow, I'm going to go ahead and just clear that out. So it's not required, but I thought it was just worth identifying or explaining as part of this video. Clear this as well. And then lastly, you've got two status options here. So there's an approval status and a rejection status. So essentially what this is saying is, what should the status change to upon approval of the workflow, and what should it change to upon rejection of the workflow? And again, these aren't required, but they probably are fairly commonly used. So in approval, I'm going to go ahead and make sure the ticket is in process at that point in time. And if the ticket gets rejected, then we're going to set the status to canceled. So I'll go ahead and save that. So now I should see those status changes occur based on the approval and rejected state of the workflow. Additionally, I mentioned stages, and I'm going to actually go ahead and create a few stages here. Let's say that I had both an approval stage and also a, say, procurement stage. And then let's do one more, a deployment stage. Okay. So these are sort of my three macro levels, if you will. And probably would have made sense to do those earlier so I could select it as I built each step. But now I'm going to come back and actually place each step in its appropriate stage. So the first one is approval. So my first few steps I'm going to put into the approval stage. So as you can see, I'm just clicking the gear here and then going to edit and then selecting my stage. Now I have to make sure that my workflow is checked out before I can do this. Again, my review computer quote is in the approval stage. Now, starting with the place computer order with vendor, I'm going to call that the procurement stage, start of the procurement stage, as well as the wait time. That's also going to be part of the procurement stage. And then my last here, and I'm going to make the deploy part of the deployment stage, and my approved computer delivery and setup part of the deployment stage. So there we go. I've assigned each of my workflow steps to a stage, and then you should see how that comes together. So at this point in time, I've created my workflow, at least the first cut. So I'm going to save and check in, and then I can actually close this workflow builder. Okay. Now I have to do a couple of additional things here. I have to actually activate my workflow, so that'll make it available to be used. And what that means is that if I open up any ticket in my ticketing application, I can say action assigned to workflow, or I can make it part of, let's say, an automation rule, or I could assign it at the service level. So at this point, we're done. And I actually think I'll do that. I'll go to my automation rules next, and then I'll connect my workflow to a particular automation rule so that we can put it in play. Now that I've got my workflow built out, I actually am going to use an automation rule to trigger my workflow. So I'm going to come up to automation rules, create a new automation rule, and call it computer purchase request. My only automation rule that I have, so I'll leave the evaluation order and stop on match just to their default. I'll save that, and I'm going to activate it, but I first need to provide a condition, and I'll just use service. Now there's a couple of ways. I wouldn't necessarily need an automation rule to do what I'm doing here, but if you haven't used them before, they're fairly powerful. You just define what the conditions are. So service is one of this. And account department is XYZ. And then you've got automation actions, which you can put into place. So I'm just going to say my computer hardware request is the service. And I'm not going to use any other conditions, but then I'm doing that so that I can come down and put that into my computer purchase workflow. So again, what I'm saying here is anytime a ticket is created with the computer request service, it should push it into this computer purchase workflow. I'll come back up and save, and then I should be good to go. So I'm going to just test this out. I'm going to pop up into, I have a service already built out, and I'm going to make the request, and I'm going to say, please order me the best laptop we have available. That's my title, my description. I'm not going to blow this out too much. I'm sure you're familiar with creating forms. I'm going to go ahead and submit this request, and then I'll go ahead and view it. And so again, I'm looking at it from the requester's point of view, and I can see already that my ticket has entered into the computer purchase workflow, and right now it's active or in process in the approval stage. The current step is the manager approval of computer purchase, and the approver of that is a user named Joe Client. And the reason, if you recall, that Joe Client is the current approver is because John Thompson, the user that I'm logged into, John Thompson's manager is Joe Client. So it automatically made Joe Client the approver. So now let's pop over to TD Next and actually see how things look from a technician standpoint. I come over to my TD Next area into my Tickets app, and then there is a ticket right there. It says, please order me the best laptop we have. So that was the item. And then you can see over here to the right that the ticket is in a workflow. So there's a workflow area of the ticket. And it shows you, again, some of the same information that we just saw from the TD Client perspective. It shows you which stage things are in. You can click on that to toggle the stage view. You can also see a history, which would show you the details of every step in the workflow process. So right now, I'm just at the first step, and it started at 10:52 and it hasn't ended yet because nothing has happened yet. But that gives a running list of all the steps and essentially what has happened. You also get a view from TD Next of the progress, which shows the builder. So at any point, somebody can come to the ticket and view the entire builder view of the ticket, and it will highlight the step that is currently active. Again, I'm at the very first step in the process. And again, just to review, that was the manager approval of the computer purchase. And right now, that is the responsibility of Joe Client. Okay, I'm going to step through the workflow that we've built. And the first step that I have, of course, is that manager approval of computer purchase. And Joe Client, because Joe Client was my manager, or John Thompson's manager here, he was assigned to be the approver in that first step. Again, I used the approver role concept of the requester's manager. So over here in another window, I've got the current workflow step to approve the computer purchase from the TD Client perspective in the client portal. So Joe Client now, as I'm signed in, is going to approve this step. I can make a comment if necessary, and that should be complete. I'm going to move that out of the way and then come back and just refresh my ticket. And you see I have now moved to the next step in the process. And that was to review the request and provide a quote and feedback. So I'm just going to kind of quickly step through a lot of these tasks just to highlight what we had built. So someone in the application development group is assigned that. I'm going to mark that complete. Next, then, there's a review computer quote, again, another approval step, and that now is assigned to the requester, which again is John Thompson. So I'm going to approve that step, make a comment if necessary. Okay, then it was another task, and again, you can see my progress happening up here. I've completed the first stage, which was the approval stage, and I'm now in that procurement stage that we set up. Again, I can view the progress, and you can see what has occurred, the path that I essentially have followed to get where I'm at right now. mark complete. So now here's where that timer step occurs. So the timer step is actually going to wait until the hardware vendor fulfills the order. So you might recall we set this to a 10-day period, so we'll have to wait until that completes. Okay, my timer step has completed. So the time that I set has passed, and now I've completed, as you can see, the second stage, and I've started the third stage, and that was a task to deploy the hardware to the requester, assigned to a different group or user. I'm going to complete that. And then lastly, there was an approval step for the requester to actually approve that the hardware was delivered and set up successfully, let's assume. So I'm going to go ahead and approve that, which should then complete my workflow. And you can see that it did here, in fact, complete my workflow, and it changed my status to in process. I don't know if that's applicable in this business case, but I just wanted to highlight how those the approval status and rejection status can actually be used to change the status of the ticket. Okay, so now I've successfully moved a ticket all the way through the workflow. Again, I've got my history and my progress that I could view and see those changes. I wanted to now go back into TD admin and take a look at our workflow builder again, because I just wanted to go back and highlight those branch and collector steps that we talked about earlier. So I'm going to come back to my workflow, my computer purchase workflow, and into the builder. And I'm going to file checkout. Okay. And now I'm going to try to highlight how this can work. I'm going to insert a new step, and it's just going to be a branch step. Okay. So I've got that created. And I'm also going to create a collector. So collector step for deployment tasks. Okay. And we'll call that a collector. Now, collectors can have a stage associated with them. The branches don't really apply to the workflow. They're really administrative, which I'll highlight here in a minute. But the collectors are actually part of the workflow, because the workflow is going to wait until all the tasks flow into the collector. So the collector is going to be that gatekeeper, if you will, until the workflow can continue. So I'm going to put that in the deployment stage. Save. Okay. So now I've got both that branch and the collector. So let's move these over here to my workflow so I can get to them. And right after my wait period, I'm going to delete the connection between those two items. Just try to give myself a little bit more space here. Okay. I'm going to take my branch, put it here, and then from my timer, that's going to go into my branch. A little bit more screen real estate. So here's my branch, and that's going to go to my deploy, but then I'm also going to create a couple of additional steps. So I'm going to create one called log asset and TDX. That's going to be a task. I'm just going to kind of sign these out here. Save that. And then one more to schedule, or let's call it hardware training. And that's also going to be a task. We're going to give that to somebody else here. Who do we have? Let's bring these over. Hopefully this is going to start to make sense what I'm going to do. Okay. So now I've got these sort of 3 deployment related tasks, and I'm just going to branch them from that branch step. So after we wait for the hardware vendor to complete the order, the workflow is going to branch to these three separate tasks that can kind of happen simultaneously. That for a minute. And then I'm going to use my collector step. Let's remove this line just to get it out of our way. Okay, I'm going to use my collector step to just move those all back together. Now, I've got a very rudimentary branch really happening here. I certainly could continue these on in a more sophisticated manner eventually to come back to a collector, or maybe there's multiple collectors that then feed into a single approval, or whatever the scenario may be. But hopefully this highlights just what the function of those two steps. The branch, again, solely serves really to make administration a little bit more easy. I could draw these lines directly out of that, but that could be a little bit more error prone when I'm putting my workflow, especially a more complex workflow, together. But the collector steps do specifically have a purpose, and they're going to, beyond just administration, they're going to pause the workflow until all of these separate tracks come back together. And then when they do, it'll go to the next step. For purposes of just this, I'm going to end the workflow. And now I'm going to save that. Okay, save and check it back in. So now let's go back and just run through the workflow one more time, and we can see that branch and that collector process come together. Okay, so I've come back into TD Next, and I have submitted another ticket here, and I'm at the point where I'm waiting for my timer step to complete. Once this timer step completes, I should be at the point where my branch takes effect. I have my active tasks, and then my collector will bring them together. And so I can view the progress here, and you should see that I'm at my timer step. My branch is going to come into play, and then hopefully then my collector will bring it all back together and kind of wait for everything before moving on to that final step. So I'm going to close that, and then I just need to wait for my timer step to complete here. All right, my timer step has completed, and you can see now that I have 3 activities that are active: the deploy, the schedule, and the log asset, and then they're each individually signed. So what could happen here is all 3 of the individuals or groups that are assigned to these tasks could come in and complete them. And you'll see once one of them completes, one of the collector step shows up. So I'll kind of do this out of order. It doesn't have to be in any particular order. And I'll complete now the last one. And then after that, my approval step becomes active. So if I look at the progress in the builder, you can see how the branch step became active. The 3 tasks coming out of the branch were active and then completed. By process of completing all of those, the collector step became active and completed, and now I'm at the point of that final approval by the original requester. I hope you enjoyed this TDX Academy video on building a ticketing workflow. Be sure to check out other videos and articles in our knowledge base at solutions.teamdynamics.com. Thank you.